Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Now, there are 84,000 people in jail in the UK. Just let that sink in for a moment. And the number is expected to go up. So I sat down this week with Justice Secretary David Gauke in a South East London prison, where we had a very frank discussion about lower sentences for women prisoners and the explosion of psychoactive drugs in jail. Let's have a listen. At HMP ISIS in South East London, they take rehabilitation seriously. Prisoners learn skills like hairdressing to help them find employment and break the reoffending cycle. In a creaking prison system, struggling with budget cuts and an explosion of drugs, this is the story the politicians want to tell. How important do you think it is to have these kind of educational courses in prisons?
It's essential because at least you can come out and know you've got something underneath your belt and you can progress to the other things instead of coming out and reoffending.
Do you think it will help people stop reoffending then?
Yeah, definitely. Instead of like a barber gets like about £200 a day, so you know it's a good little wage. So, you know what I mean? You can come out instead of reoffending, you can make decent money for that.
I sat down with Justice Secretary David Gauke to learn about his vision for the prison system.
What society, I think, wants is to see the prison system as something that does give people a second chance. Yes, it's there for punishment, but if we don't break a cycle of criminality in prison, you just end up with more reoffending. So I'm really keen to ensure that we get focused on employment, that the prison system helps people move into employability. And so there's a whole range of things that we're doing to deliver that.
We're sitting in a prison right now that takes rehabilitation pretty seriously. I mean, it's obvious by looking at what the guys are doing behind us and learning about hairdressing. But reoffending costs the UK £15 billion a year. I mean, can you really sit here and say that the prison system's working?
Well, we certainly need to bring those reoffending levels down, and they've been stubbornly high, and you're absolutely right to say the cost for society as a whole is extraordinarily high. That £15 billion, the analysis suggests it is. So we've got to do more, and I think the best way we can do that is to be very focused on work. We know when we look at the sort of welfare reforms that we've undertaken as a government that we can reduce worklessness, and that is good for individuals and it's good for society. Work does give people a sense of purpose, it gives them a stake in society, means that they take responsibility for themselves, and it gives them greater economic security. So if we can change the culture so that more prisoners are willing to take that responsibility and work towards it, prisons provide the support and employers provide the opportunities, I think we can do a lot more to reduce those reoffending rates.
Are too many people in prison?
I think the level is higher than I would want it to be. I don't think one should have an arbitrary number and say we're going to bring it down to a particular number, but when you put it in context, 25 years ago we had 44,000 people in prison. Today it's 84,000. It's been more or less that level for the last 8 years.
That's too high, you'd say then?
I think that's too high. I would like to bring it down, but I don't think one should have an arbitrary figure. I think what do we do to bring it down? If we can reduce reoffending, that actually is important. A lot of people in prison are back in prison for their second or third spell. Also, if we can look at non-custodial sentences, ensure that they are effective, that they are properly used. The evidence, for example, on short sentences is that they are not very good when it comes to rehabilitation. People are more likely to reoffend after a short sentence in prison than if they got a similar non-custodial sentence. So I certainly encourage people to look at those non-custodial routes.
I'm keen to talk about that idea about short sentences because one group of people who tend to have short sentences is women. The majority of women in prison for non-violent offences tend to have short sentences, which means they don't get a chance of rehabilitation, but it might destroy their family life, for example. I mean, is that an area that we should look at?
Absolutely, and we will be setting out a women's offenders strategy, a female offender strategy later on.
So when is that going to happen? Because you were supposed to have published it already, weren't you?
Well, we will be publishing very soon, so it's not very far off. Well, I don't want to give announcements.
Weeks or months or next year? Or?
It'll certainly will be not next year, and I don't think you'll have to wait very long. But the point that you're making is a very good one. And actually, I think we do have to be conscious that sometimes there are different issues with women offenders than there are with men. A lot of female offenders, for example, are themselves victims of crime. Quite a high proportion are victims of domestic abuse themselves. So we need to make sure that it's properly focused. A lot of them are non-violent. A lot of them, there are complex mental health issues that we need to address. But yes, I think there's a very good point in saying with the 4,000 or so female offenders who are in custody, how many of them can be dealt with through other means? And
so non-custodial
sentences are certainly something to look at. More support in the community rather than within prisons, I think, is something that we have to look at. There will, of course, still be women who need to be in prison, serious offenders, but I think there is scope to look at that number, and I think that number could come down.
Another area that lots of people say needs to be addressed is the number of prison staff, and that is what leads to some of the issues that we are seeing in prison. So how many prison officers have been lost since 2010?
Well, since 2010, there was a fall of 5,000 or so prison officers, but at the moment we are recruiting. So in October 2016, we announced that we would recruit an additional 2,500, and we have actually exceeded that number so far. It's 3,111 additional prison officers have been recruited. Actually, we're continuing to recruit more prison officers. So if you're
recruiting more prisoners, was it a mistake then to cut those prison officers in the first place? Did austerity go too far?
Well, I think we have to put this in the context of one of the things that happened in the early part of this decade after we made difficult decisions in terms of the prison numbers, was the fact that new psychoactive substances became a much bigger problem within prisons. And that has increased the tension within prisons. It has fueled violence within prisons. And in those circumstances, I think it was absolutely right to make the decision that we did 18 months or so ago to increase the number of prison officers. And as I say, we're ahead of schedule on what we announced. We're continuing to recruit. And the full benefit of that, I mean, we're already seeing more prison officers out there, which is good news, and certainly I've visited prisons who say we're seeing the benefits of it now. But that is going to build up over the years ahead as those new prison officers become more experienced, they learn the jail craft, if you like, and they become more and more effective. So in that sense, I think we're moving in the right direction. But I'm not going to deny we've got challenges such as the level of drugs in prisons that we have to address.
Yeah, let's talk about the level of drugs in prisons, because I think it's interesting what you're saying, that this is a relatively new, I mean, obviously not a new phenomenon of having drugs in prisons, but that the level has exploded effectively. Yeah. You said it was as easy for a prisoner to get drugs in prison as it would be to get a delivery, a takeaway. I mean, this sounds like something out of the wire.
I mean, it has definitely changed things. It's these new psychoactive substances. You're absolutely right to say, like spice, for example. So you're absolutely right. There's always been an issue with drugs in prisons, but it is deteriorated because of these new substances. And you give you an example of how it might get smuggled in. What you get is something which is purportedly a solicitor's letter, so it benefits from legal privilege and so on. It's actually not. It's soaked in spice, and then it comes in and is smoked. And so there are challenges in terms of preventing that getting in, but there are things we can do. So, for example, we're training more sniffer dogs. We're looking at what we can do about scanners in prisons where this is a particular issue. We're training staff further on this. We're making sure that there's more intelligence at a central level that we can pick these things up. We're increasing the ability of downloading information from mobile phones which are smuggled in, but when they are confiscated, up until now it's taken a while to get the information off them. If we can download that information quickly, we can take action, for example, to stop some smuggling. So there are steps that we're taking. It's not an easy, straightforward process, but we are very focused on that because we do need to get those basics right.
Just to give a bit of an illustration about how big a problem this is, we've had situations, haven't we, where nurses have had to go to hospital because they've been inhaling spice that's in the atmosphere in prisons. Yeah. I mean, this sounds completely out of control.
Well, it is shocking when you hear those stories. I absolutely accept that, and that's why we need to take action to deal with that. And so those points about the security and discipline within prisons, I would make the other point, the other side of it as well, is that we need to make sure that there's purpose in prison, that there are positive incentives. One of the points that comes back to what I've been saying about work is that if you can offer prisoners, if they behave, the opportunity to be released on temporary license to go out to work, that is a prospect that is important to them. That is an opportunity that they will want to take. So we've got to have those positive incentives, those carrots, if you like, as well as the sticks to make sure we've got proper discipline in prison.
And this week, the Police Federation said that we should also be looking at white middle-class drug users, not just street gangs, in order to try and stop the kind of the drugs trade effectively. So do you think there should be a focus on people who take cocaine at dinner parties as well?
Well, I think that the issue that people who do that have to recognise that they are fueling the industry that is resulting in the knife crimes, that is resulting in the difficulties we have in prisons. But the violent crime that we see inside and outside prison is strongly linked to drugs trade.
And do you think people just don't realise it?
Absolutely. I think there's a sort of, I think there's a, along with everything else about drugs in that context, there is also a point of the damage that is doing to the fabric of our society by funding a drugs trade that is doing enormous damage, and there is a responsibility for middle class people who take cocaine at a dinner party, that when they see a story of a 15-year-old being stabbed in Hackney, well, they should feel a degree of guilt and responsibility.
Have you ever taken drugs?
No.
There you go. Easy answer to that question then. I just want to talk a little bit more generally about the prison service as well, before we can go on to other things, because it feels to me that you're supposed to be building more prisons. You're supposed to be closing down or revamping the kind of Victorian estate. You're hiring more officers, and yet you're also having to make savings. Something's got to give. Where on earth are you going to find these savings?
We will set out our plans for our budget this year. It is the case that we have got a tight budget. I was in the Treasury for 7 years, and I know about the fact that we have to live within our means, and that we inherited a very high deficit that we had to take steps to bring it down.
You're going to have to make some pretty big decisions. I mean, are you still planning on building 4 new prisons?
Yeah, we are committed to creating 10,000 new prison places, and that will require us to build new prisons. It is right that we do build new prisons to ensure that we've got an estate that is fit for purpose. Over the longer term, that actually can reduce costs, because a lot of older prisons can be very expensive to run. So we will do that, and I am ambitious in terms of what we can do in terms of improving our prison estate. But yes, there are challenges in terms of our budget. But I do believe that if we can put resources in the right direction, for example, what I've been talking about this week is using our education budget in a better way, in a smarter way, so that education spending within prisons, governors have got greater control over it, they can spend the money better, and that expenditure is better focused on employment than it has been in the past. So we've always got to be conscious that this is taxpayers' money and we have to spend it well.
Now, I'm keen to talk to you about Brexit, of course. You're not in the Brexit subcommittee, but you are, of course, in the cabinet. So are you a max VAT kind of guy, or are you more of a customs partnership man?
I think we have to look at both options, and the government has got 3 objectives in terms of where we get to here. One is ensuring that our trade with the European Union is as frictionless as possible. Second, ensuring that we abide by our obligations under the Good Friday Agreement in terms of Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. And third, ensuring that we can make progress in entering into trade deals with other countries, and that we can reduce trade barriers with those. Now,
you see, they're both possible, but I mean, HMRC have said that max VAT will cost £20 billion a year. I mean, this is more than we'd be paying to the EU net. I mean, what on earth? That can't be on the table, can it?
Well, we have to look at all the options, and they have got, both the options that we set out. They've got advantages and disadvantages. We need to look very closely at how they would work and what the options are, and find a way forward that ensures that the UK economy can prosper, that we minimise trade barriers with the EU and indeed with the rest of the world, and that we abide by the obligations of the Good Friday Agreement. Now, there are, as I say, advantages and disadvantages with both those proposals, but there are cabinet subcommittees that are looking at those, analysing our options, and they will come forward with their thoughts.
There's reports that the Prime Minister considered appointing you to the Brexit subcommittee, but then forgot. If she had done, would she have had a balance in favour of the customs partnership?
I would have taken part in those discussions. I would have looked at the arguments, discussed the arguments, and well, I think it's helpful on these committee meetings.
Come on, you can
I
give
think it's helpful on these
that.
committee meetings, to be honest, that we can have these discussions in private and a full and frank debate.
Do you think that there is an argument that we should stay in a customs union until we have a situation where we can leave the EU in a kind of orderly fashion, until they have worked out the best way of doing that?
I think it's very important that we reduce our frictions in trade, that we don't bring in additional frictions in how we trade as much as possible. But we want to make progress in terms of putting in place a new situation that meets the three objectives that I talked about a moment or so ago.
But if that doesn't happen, then there should be an option, you would say, then to try and keep this trade as frictionless as possible, to perhaps extend, for example, the amount of time we're in a customs union.
Well, clearly we don't want to be in the position where suddenly we are faced with a very difficult situation in terms of making it difficult to trade with the EU, and that's one of our objectives, of ensuring that is as frictionless as possible. So we need to consider that, but our priority at the moment is to look at those two options and make as much progress on there and take that forward.
David Gauke there, speaking in prison.
Now, earlier this week, the Justice Secretary, David Gauke, announced a new strategy for prisoners to improve employment prospects. The government has even suggested ex-offenders could play a vital role in filling expected gaps in the workforce after we leave the European Union. Well, joining us now from Perthshire is the Prisons Minister, Rory Stewart. Thank you very much for talking to us today. Looks like a beautiful day in Scotland.
It's a really, really beautiful day, and I'm going to go and hopefully have some time to look at the Scottish prison system later in the week, but it's beautiful weather here.
Of course, you only have responsibility for the prison system in England and Wales. Can you tell us why you think it is that the prison population has doubled over the last 25 years?
Yes, a lot of this is to do with longer sentences. So although the population of Britain has increased much smaller amounts, as you say, the prison population has almost doubled, and that's largely because of longer sentences for violent crime, but also many, many more sex offenders. Nearly a quarter of our prisoners now are sex offenders, many of them older men in for historic sex offences.
And so the Justice Minister was talking about various measures to try and lower the number of people who are in prisons this week. Let's pick up on a couple of them. Shorter sentences with a presumption against anybody being sentenced for 12 months was one of them, which would see people who had committed violent offences not being punished in prison. Is that right?
So he's talking about a presumption against sentences for under 12 months, and there'll have to be exceptions to that. And you're right that people who've committed violent crimes may be one of those exceptions, probably would be. But the key point is this, that many people are going to prison only for a matter of weeks, or even in some cases on recall only for a matter of days, and that's just not long enough to give any chance to really work with someone in terms of educating them and turning their life around. And the statistics demonstrate that sending someone to prison for a very short period makes them more likely to reoffend compared to a community sentence. So it's not good for them, and it's not good for public safety.
But you'll know very well, one of the reasons magistrates are reluctant to use more community sentences is because they don't think they're supervised properly.
Yes, absolutely. And this is something we've heard from magistrates and judges. But we have to be very clear. There are two different things here. One is punishing somebody for committing a crime, and people should be punished for their crimes. But we also have to think about protecting the public in general. Reoffending rates are far too high from short sentences because short sentences seem to be long enough to dislocate the individual, take them away from their home, their family, make it much more difficult for them perhaps to reintegrate into society when they return, but not long enough to do the work in education and employment we need to really turn their lives around. And they're also very disruptive for prisons. One of the reasons why we have a lot of problems in prisons is these people cycling in and out for a few days or weeks at a time. So I strongly agree with the Justice Secretary. If we could massively reduce the number of people who are in there for sentences of under 12 months, it will be good for public safety, good for the individuals and good for the prison system.
Now, David Gauke, the Justice Minister, was also talking about release on temporary licence, allowing offenders out to work, principally in the community. And he made an absolutely astonishing admission when he was talking about that and said offenders could help fill the gaps in the workforce that will be left after Brexit when EU nationals aren't here working in agriculture and construction and catering anymore. Has it really come to this that we need to use prisoners to fill gaps in the workforce left by Brexit?
The point that he was trying to make is that whereas a few years ago it might have been quite difficult for a prisoner to get a job, we're now in a situation where we've got the highest employment rates since records began in the early 1970s. And the point that he was making is that partly because of Brexit, there is a labour shortage, which means that prisoners with the right kind of training, the right kind of attitudes, as Pret a Manger are finding, or Greggs the bakers are finding, or Timpson's the shoe company is finding, can provide very loyal, good employees. And that's also good because somebody with a job is much less likely to offend.
Yet, this idea to allow more people release on temporary licence is the exact opposite of what's been happening for the last few years, where we actually saw a significant drop by about a third in the people who were released out to work. And that was because there had been problems with people absconding and people offending while they were there. Why this complete U-turn on the idea of people being allowed out on temporary licence?
Well, we've been back and forth, as you say, but this has been a question of degree. Release on temporary licence has been part of the system for many, many years. And the basic reason for that is that you don't want to throw someone straight out of the prison gate into society. You have to give them an opportunity to begin to establish themselves so it's not a cliff edge. The idea is you remain in prison, but during the day you go out and you work in Greggs or you work in Timpson's, you get the skills, and then when you leave the prison, you've got the job to go to. And in fact, you're talking about reoffending. Only 1 in 10,000 people on release and temporary licence go on to commit a serious crime. So it's a very, very rare thing to happen. In the vast majority of cases, what it's actually doing is protecting the public because they're much more likely to get a job. And when they get a job, they're much less likely to commit a crime. So if what we're worried about is protecting the public against crime, release on temporary licence works very well.
Let me ask you about one other issue. Obviously, there is political response to the overwhelming vote in Ireland yesterday to change the abortion law. Some of your ministerial colleagues have been making their views clear this morning, saying that they think that there should now be change in the law in Northern Ireland. Penny Mordaunt, Anne Milton, the skills minister, also saying that she would favour a free vote and liberalising the law in Northern Ireland. What are your views?
I think this is a very sensitive issue. The whole creation of the Stormont Assembly, the autonomy for Northern Ireland, goes to the heart of all the conflict in Ireland that's taken place for more than 100 years. So we have to respect the fact that this is a devolved issue. This is an issue for the people of Northern Ireland. It's, of course, an issue that people feel very strongly about. I feel very strongly about it personally. And it's something that we vote for on a free vote in the House of Commons. But it isn't the job. And it would be very, very dangerous for British politicians to be seen to be telling people in Northern Ireland how to vote.
But whilst there is no executive in Northern Ireland,
a peaceful situation in Northern Ireland is because we've delegated. I'm sorry?
Whilst there is no executive operating in Northern Ireland, it may fall to the British government. You say you have very strong views about this. What would you like to see happen to the abortion laws in Northern Ireland?
So I feel very strongly that that is a temporary situation. You're right, there isn't a parliament in Stormont at the moment. So that puts a huge degree of trust and responsibility on the Westminster government to have an interim government. But that mustn't be used to make fundamental constitutional, ethical changes on behalf of the people of Northern Ireland. It should be seen as a caretaker situation. Those kind of decisions need to be made by the Stormont Parliament when that's up and running again.
Rory Stewart, thank you very much for talking to us.